Our next session is going to begin now, and this is going to be on social, clinical, health, and developmental aspects of compassion. And for me personally, of course, the healthcare or health impact resonates deeply because, you know, in fact, this entire aspect is important. Oftentimes, as we all know, we get caught up in our minds and the intellectual constructs here, and which is wonderful. But at the end of the day, unless what we do has an impact on society, has an impact on those around us, looking at images of brains eliciting compassion isn't going to do a whole lot of good. So really, I think this is where the rubber hits the road, and this is where ultimately the work that you all wish to become engaged in or are engaged in will have its most powerful effect. How do we translate the research into the power it potentially has within our species? So without further ado, we have, you know, many of these people. I think Emma is speaking first. So thank you.
Emma, I'm Associate Director of CCARE. And when I went to graduate school, I was really interested in compassion. And in particular, as I was looking through the literature, again and again, you see this thing that we feel more compassion towards people, that we feel more connected to. So I thought, okay, what brings about that connection? What brings about that sense of belongingness? Why do I feel belongingness to certain people, perhaps, and why does our belongingness extend to a certain degree and maybe not to another degree? So I'm going to start with a couple quotes. First by Mother Teresa. This is about that sense of connection. Being unwanted, unloved, uncared for, forgotten by everybody, I think that is a much greater hunger, a much greater poverty than the person who has nothing to eat. And this is by a psychologist from Reichman about social connection, and the longing for interpersonal intimacy stays with every human being from infancy throughout life, and there is no human being who is not threatened by its loss. The human being is born with the need for contact and tenderness. And I'm going to show you a little bit of an avalanche of data supporting these facts just to bring home that point about the importance of social connection. In fact, happiness researchers pretty much agree that social connection is the greatest source of happiness and fulfillment for people. So social connection has been linked it has been said to be a fundamental human need, and this across all different fields of psychology. So in developmental psychology, it's been looked at more under research on attachment. Clinical or sociological research has looked at it at social support, emotional support, loneliness. In personality psychology, Maslow's hierarchy of needs were brought up earlier by Cliff, and really after safety and physiological needs are met, our greatest needs is for love and belonging. And this throughout our life. So you're probably all familiar with the study of Harlow's rhesus monkey and how monkeys who were deprived of a maternal care really had severe developmental issues, were no longer able to nurture their own children when they had them. So throughout our life, low social connection can have a huge impact. So I'm going to go over very, very quickly a lot of different impacts that it has. So in infancy, we know it leads to developmental deficits and even death. There was a number of studies done on Romanian orphanages that I'm sure you're familiar with on these kind of sad facts. In adolescence and adulthood, low social connection is linked to psychological distress, negative emotionality, pessimism, anxiety, depression, low trust, low self-esteem, violence, and suicide. I've done a lot of work with veterans in particular, and they feel a real low social connection, and as you know, there's a huge suicide problem going on with that population. And in the case of psychopathology, low social connection is predictive of relapse. So, and even if we look at, at the impact of personality on well-being, for example, we know that extroversion is linked to greater well-being, and neuroticism to greater psychological distress. If we look at why is that the case, what mediates that, and it's actually social connection. So extroverts have high social connection, and that is what leads to increased well-being. And people with higher neuroticism scales have lower social connection in general, which would mediate that impact on greater psychological distress.
What about introversion?
Actually, this study that I looked at was focusing mostly on these, but I'll get back to you on that because I'll look it over again. And I think that introversion doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, you can be an introvert and feel high social connection, but I'll get into that more. So this is where I'm going to give you a slew of data on the impact of low social connection on health and well-being. So first of all, it's as unhealthy as obesity, high blood pressure, and smoking, which is something we don't really know about. If we think, oh, I want to take care of my health, we think about exercise and things like that, but not, oh, how connected do I feel to people? Low social connection has been linked to an increased risk of sleep disturbance, elevated blood pressure, which increases risk for mortality, weakening of the immune system, chronically elevated cortisol, chronically elevated activation of the HP axis, and this ties in really well with Stephanie, who has been talking on related points. Accelerated physiological decline with aging, Alzheimer's and dementia, inflammation at the cellular level, which Emiliana, I think, brought up Stephen Cole's work, and earlier mortality. And we all know about the social exclusion is probably one of the greatest sources of anxiety that we have. And it's loneliness hurts. Social rejection and physical pain share the same brain regions, activation in the same brain regions, which I think was also brought up by Emiliana. It's just that point that social connection is really important for us, and when it's not there, it leads to not just psychological distress, but huge health impacts. So the good news, high social connection linked to subjective well-being and happiness, higher self-esteem, social self-confidence, resiliency across broad array of events and environments. So, and you can think about it, if you feel more connected, you also, and you have higher social self-esteem, that just furthers more social connection. Higher optimism and trust, pro-sociality, 50% increased chance of longevity, strengthened immunity, resilience against life threats. I promise not all my slides will be an avalanche of data, but I just want to try to hit home a point here. And again, Stephanie brought up earlier the impact of oxytocin and opioids that they might help to buffer us against stress and the impact of stress. And now some, not just social connection, but actually giving, social connection in the sense of really wanting to do for others. Stephanie Brown has this paper, this is like the paper that I'm always citing, the impact of giving has a greater impact on longevity and health outcomes than receiving support. So it's really in that act of being engaged and giving. And an interesting study by Sarah Conrath shows that volunteers live longer than non-volunteers, but only if they're doing it for the right reasons. So not if they're like, oh, I'm going to live longer. So now that we know those facts, you should do it. So a really interesting study looked at, well, how connected do Americans feel in general? And it was a large questionnaire study that was done across a representative sample of people, asking them, how many people in your life do you feel close enough to share a personal problem with? So you can think for yourself what that might be. And what do you think the modal number was? What was the number that most people replied?
1, 2, 3.
The modal number was 0. Over 25% of people have no one that they feel close enough to share a personal problem with. So it's kind of a revelation, right? 1 in 4 people maybe that we meet, maybe 1 in 4 people in this room, I don't know. But it's that sense of, wow, it has such an impact, and we know there's a number of studies showing that social networks are decreasing at the moment. So we don't know what to attribute that to, but it seems to be happening. So,
It's all on Facebook now.
Yeah. Could be. There's studies looking into that as well. So, but in terms of the social connection, some people think, oh, I have to have all these friends. But actually, what the research shows, and I think this is where our work really comes into play, is that the benefits are linked to your subjective sense of connection. So it doesn't matter whether you have 20 million friends or not. It's that sense of, do I feel belongingness? Even if I don't know anyone in this room, can I come in here and feel belongingness? And so, and the other determinant of the impact of social connection is the affectionate feel. So this is where compassion comes in. So affection and subjective perception. So now with all that background, when I was working on my dissertation, I wanted to see, is there a way to increase social connection using a compassionate-based meditation? And we used loving kindness meditation, which I know for some of the Buddhist scholars, they may not think that loving kindness and compassion are different, but bear with me for just this study. You can bring those up, those important points up too. So I'll go pretty quickly over the methods because I want to get to some more data after that, and I can talk to you more about it afterwards. But basically, we had people come in, and they were either assigned to a loving kindness meditation or to a matched meditation, and I'll describe what those were. So loving kindness meditation is we worked with forgetting her name now. Sharon Salzberg, yeah. And so you can think of this meditation as, in the first part, kind of remembering people that love you, bringing them to mind, feeling that sense of love, and then starting to send it out to first other loved ones that you bring to mind, or just sending that love right back to them, and then to other people, including strangers, etc. So that's this one way that meditation is conducted. And so we had to make it so that we could use it in the lab. We had to adjust it a little bit. So this would be a stranger. So first you generate that love back to your mom, and then a stranger, or whoever your loved one was that you brought to mind. So we had people come in, we measured their mood and their sense of connection before the intervention, and then they were either assigned to the loving kindness meditation group or to a neutral control, and then we measured mood and connection again afterwards. And this is what the loving kindness meditation looked like. We wanted to measure connection to a person in a photograph. So we had people start the meditation the way they would. So imagining people that loved them around them, sort of sending them love, feeling that love within. And then they opened their eyes and looked at the picture of a stranger, matched for age, ethnicity, gender, and generated the love towards that person. Kind of like, and using the phrases that Sharon gave us, may you be well, may you be happy, kind of phrases. And for the neutral manipulation, we wanted to match it as much as possible. So again, people imagined in the first part other people around them, and they didn't imagine loved ones. It was just strangers, and they thought about what those people might look like, what kind of clothes they might be wearing. And then they opened their eyes, and again they had a target, and that target was same, matched for gender, age, ethnicity, and they would focus on their facial features. So they were asked to just look at their eyebrows, shape of their nose, that kind of thing. So we're really trying to match for imagining people around you, and then looking at a person, and then engaging with that photograph in some way. In terms of the questions, we asked them about their mood, their mood before and after. And then we asked, this is the explicit questions. We're like, okay, how connected do you feel? How similar do you feel? How positive do you feel toward this person? But just like Daryl brought up earlier, it's really important to not just ask subjective questions, because at the end of the day, people might just like us and be like, okay, I'll just say I feel more connected because that's apparently what they want me to say. So we also wanted to look at, they were asked how connected they felt to the target, but also to a non-target photograph. And then after that, we measured implicit connection, and the way we did it was a similar test to what Daryl was describing. So participants were given words and were told, judge if this word is positive or negative. And say they saw words like angry, kind, and right before the word showed up, they would see a picture of the photograph, either of the target of meditation or the neutral or the non-target. So it looked like this. Imagine this was your target meditation, and your job is to judge if the word is positive or negative. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'll go right to the results because I want to share a little bit more after that about some other studies. So we looked at changes in explicit connection, and toward the non-target, people felt more connected. Not surprising, they were looking at their photograph and looking at their face, engaging. To the target of, so the red bars of the loving kindness meditation group, the blue bars of the neutral group, those who went through the neutral visualization, and in the loving kindness meditation group, they felt more connected to the target than to the non-target. And in terms of changes in implicit connectedness, so So toward the non-target, there was no change pre and post, but toward the target, there was. And so they were basically, the way you interpret it is the increase that you see above 0 is more positivity. So that means that if they saw a word like kind after the photograph, they would be quicker at judging that it was a positive word. And if they saw a word like a negative word like angry, they were slower at rating that word as negative, if that makes sense. So it's like they were positively biased by the photograph. Okay, and real quick, we also looked at change in mood. Some people said, oh, well, they probably felt great after doing all that loving kindness meditation, and yep, they did. They felt pretty good. But when we looked at mediation, we found that a change in mood predicted explicit connections, so they felt good, and when they said they felt that they felt more connected or similar to the person, it predicted that, but it didn't predict the implicit automatic reaction, so suggesting that there's something else going on in terms of connection there. Okay, I'm at 15. I'm going to share a couple. Oops, these are the. I'm going to share just for a couple more minutes because, you know, some of us were talking about, okay, so when we want to increase compassion, do we need to do compassion type meditation? How do we do it? And I think Tim and Brooke brought up a really important point yesterday when they said, you know what? We're naturally compassionate. That's the assumption that you guys are taking with yours. And it's really about uncovering, maybe removing the obstacles to that. And then the research I've done with veterans, which I won't go into, they had PTSD. They had just come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And we did basically a trauma reduction program that was yoga and breathing-based, yoga, breathing, meditation-based program. And the reduction in symptoms was wonderful. We had decreases in PTSD that persisted 1 year later, and I didn't measure compassion because that wasn't what we were looking at. But what I saw is that the participants who went through the active group, who benefited from the reduction in symptoms, started to feel more connected to others and started to engage in more social causes. And perhaps because they're veterans and they're already in the military, service is something that's part of their life, they started engaging in service again as civilians. So I think this is just something to think about as you're thinking about the studies you're working on, if you're working with anxious populations, that even addressing that can actually lead us to that maybe natural state of compassion that we are when we reduce that anxiety. So just a hypothesis here. Okay, I have more, but I think I might have to stop.
In the interest of time, I'm going to really shorten some complicated stuff. So I just encourage you, if you are interested in health, to come talk with me later. And I'll do my best to get through this in 10 minutes, and that's why I'm going quickly. Back to this model. I use this model to try to understand how features of the caregiving system motivation could have something to do with longevity, because as you just heard nicely from Emma, that there are many studies that suggest that something about helping behavior and social connection is helping us live longer and protecting us from disease. So I'm trying to figure out how can this model help us understand those mechanisms. Okay, so first of all, with the hypothalamus being, just to remind you, the hypothalamus is the motivational command center. Oxytocin is a modulator. I talked about progesterone being released from oxytocin to reduce the organism's fear and the organism's focus on their own needs. And then the MPOA disruption of that means that hypothalamic disruption of the stress circuit, the signals going from the amygdala to the periaqueductal gray. Those are the main features that I'm looking at for their links to health. So where do we find these links to health? In the hypothalamus, what's interesting about the hypothalamus is very well known, is that the hypothalamus is responsible for physiological homeostasis in the body. Everything from temperature regulation to food metabolism, every aspect of your body that's involved in regulation is under the control of the hypothalamus. I shouldn't say every, virtually all. Oxytocin is a modulator. Now this is really interesting. You'll find many studies that show that if you increase oxytocin, you are going to decrease pro-inflammatory cytokines. So you're going to decrease the inflammatory response. Studies that have looked at how this happens have begun to suggest that it's happening not because oxytocin is directly influencing the inflammation response, but actually what it's doing is manipulating the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve has the ability to shut off the immune response. All right, because remember this parasympathetic system that's involved in rest and digest and its reparative functions. Well, that is under the control of the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve has powerful, potent effects on the immune system. Oxytocin has been shown to have effects on the vagal input. Next, the oxytocin release of progesterone. To me, I think progesterone has the potential of being the holy grail when it comes to understanding health effects of social connection. Progesterone is involved in almost all features of physiological homeostasis, including regulation of the immune system. It's also neuroprotective. It's being given now in treatments for traumatic brain injury, and it's thought to have some interesting properties for treating Alzheimer's. And so there are studies going on, clinical trials right now, to use progesterone for its ability to protect the myelination in the neurons, to basically restore any sort of damage back to normal levels of functioning. And we talked very briefly about progesterone's role in stress regulation. Progesterone's metabolites are known to have similar potency to benzodiazepines. So what you take if you're taking anti-anxiety medication, what progesterone produces is actually the same level of strength to anxiety medication. And progesterone is thought to have a role in depression. It's also thought to reduce suicidal tendencies and to have this antidepressant property. Now, one confusing thing about progesterone is it increases in response to pain. It increases in response to depression, especially chronic pain, theoretically because it is coming in as an antidote to the harmful effects of exposure to stress hormones. So it's not going to be as simple as just looking at progesterone to see whether it's a good thing for health or a bad thing for health, because often the most vulnerable populations are going to have the highest levels of progesterone. And then finally, the naturally occurring relationship, the neural arrangement between the MPOA and that stress circuit suggests that stress regulation is an important part of activating this other focused, compassionate system. And to explain in a little bit more detail why stress regulation is so critical, let me just tell you a little bit about disease pathways. We know that exposure to stress over short periods of time is very effective for the organism. That this acute stress helps you mobilize resources that had previously been directing to rest and digest and build and repair, and it's taking those resources and saying, no, we need to change your metabolic output so that you can respond to the dangers in your environment. All right, so that redirection is actually a very healthy thing. If you stood up from your chair and tried to walk around without a stress response that did that, you would die. All right, so this stress response is very good, very protective. With prolonged exposure, though, we develop an insensitivity to the stress hormones that are helping to turn off the system. And so what happens is that we start to put our bodies at risk for chronic inflammation. So that means this overactivation of the stress response. And what happens with this overactivation and chronic inflammation is that we become susceptible to disease. I won't go into too much detail about how that occurs, but I will say that there's so many diseases right now, from cancer to lung disease to diabetes to obesity, that are thought to be lethal and problematic because of chronic inflammation. So inflammation is now starting to be something that we think of as something very common underlying a variety of different health problems. So theoretically, something that can interrupt stress or interrupt that chronic exposure or interrupt inflammation would be beneficial because it would disrupt this. Aging, death, the way aging leads to death has been attributed to increased difficulty at regulating homeostasis of the immune system, that it is really due to inflammation. And then cancer and IL-6. I'm just going to tell you very briefly that some exciting work coming out of the University of Michigan suggests that there is something called a lethal feedback loop that happens with a particular cytokine known as interleukin-6. And what happens is this, that when there's damage to cells in the body, that can come from bacteria, that can come from assault or injury, or the psychological experience of stress that would basically cause some sort of damage. Oxidative stress may be a familiar term to you. What happens is stem cells, undifferentiated stem cells, get recruited to replace and to serve the function of these damaged cells. Interleukin-6 is really important for bringing in these stem cells, but what it has to do to get the stem cells to where they need to be to replace these damaged cells is it has to tell the immune system, you know what, or it has to tell those cells, ignore input from the immune system. So whatever is going on that tells cells to die or tells other cells to, to stop proliferating, interleukin-6 is basically saying ignore all of that and just go crazy and serve this function and replace this damaged tissue. But what happens is, as that damaged tissue then gets replaced and there's growth, then interleukin-6 sees this as an invader and as now something that needs to be targeted for more stem cells to come in and replace all the damage that's being caused by this invader. So what's the thinking behind this is that there is a lethal feedback loop that occurs. Well, one of the things that's, pardon me?
I'm just some folklore.
Okay, so that there's a lethal feedback loop that occurs with interleukin-6, and in fact studies with mice where they are able to disrupt interleukin-6 production shows that they can take tumors and reduce them by half the size. There's just all, and change the mortality rate. There's all kinds of really incredible, exciting research coming out suggesting that, in fact, interrupting that cycle could be very beneficial for lethal forms of cancer. Well, one of the things progesterone does is it downregulates interleukin-6. And so that's one possible way that this could be beneficial. What the other thing progesterone does is it, unlike oxytocin, which stimulates some things that are harmful in terms of the body's immune system, progesterone almost amps up the beneficial effects of the immune system, and it, while dampening down and decreasing the harmful effects. That's why I say it's involved in immune homeostasis. And think about it logically from the perspective of pregnancy. Progesterone somehow is able to turn off the immune system of the mother so that it doesn't reject the fetus, while still protecting the mother and the fetus from disease. So it's a wonderful model system for thinking about how to interface with disease. So, and to protect the body. So in summary, the benefits of social connection in the first paper that Emma talked about, I had attributed to prosocial behavior or activation of this caregiving system. And these are examples of evidence that basically supports the idea that there's something about activating the system that's beneficial for health. But we can't go from these studies and then work backwards and say, oh, why is this happening? We need new studies, and there have been a few that have been done. One is I looked to see whether the effects of prosocial behavior on mortality were indeed mediated by stress buffering. And we did find that people who had not helped anyone who were exposed to stress had doubled their increased risk of dying with every subsequent life event. People who had helped someone in the last year, untouched by exposure to a stressful life event, it had no effect on mortality risk. So that supported our mechanisms. And Sarah's paper about how when we focus, volunteers that were focused on causes outside themselves lived longer. As a reason for volunteering, we found that it was this other focused motivation that was predicting longevity. Self-focused motivation, volunteers look like non-volunteers. Okay, so in my studies, we are finding effects with mortality risk with just saying I've done one thing in the last year without receiving compensation, and it can be very much like a threshold thing. So that's why it looks a little like social isolation. It can be a continuous measure of hours, but it can also be just, have you done something or not? I shouldn't do this because I said to hold the questions. So I just want to be courteous to the people coming after me who need even more time than I do. So if you don't mind saving your questions till the end, I'll be happy to talk with anyone over lunch.
So yesterday we spoke about Tier 1, Tier 2, expert-mediated interventions and paraprofessional trained-to-trainers interventions. Today we'll talk about Tier number 3, which is technology web-based intervention in order to reach a lot of people. And it was explained to me that I've been invited here as the clinical person to talk about clinical issues. So I'm going to say some clinical things now in order to bring home the point that the whole division between clinical and non-clinical, us and them, in my perspective, is a little bit silly. So I'll explain what I mean by that. Here's some data. 46% of Americans at some point will report experiencing clinically significant distress, meeting a DSM diagnosis, having any one of these problems. So 46% of the population will report being included in a clinical population. So that sounds like a lot, but really that doesn't capture the picture, because this whole deal of clinical, that's not a real thing. That's a man-made construct. It's a language. It has utility, but it's a language. So I'll illustrate what I mean. If you have the clinical cutoff right here, for instance, depression, you need 5 symptoms for depression to have major depression, right? So how about if you just have 3? How about if you're only sad every day and you feel worthless and you want to kill yourself? Guess what? You're not clinically depressed. You're just sad, worthless, and suicidal. And actually, you're not within the 46%.
Is that DSM-5?
It's not far from that. We'll get into that later. But yeah, those principles maintained. So the deal is that actually when we say 46, we're talking between 60 and 70%, possibly more, manifesting clinically significant distress. So that's an issue. So I think when we get to that kind of percentages, the idea of us and them, to me, becomes a little bit silly, and that's a very important point for me to make. So the principles of shared humanity and the capacity to reach large populations are important, I think, across the gamut. So when we talk about scalability, I think that it's really important that your heart is in the right place. We don't want to be just cold-hearted technicians, and I think we need to love what we do in terms of direct contact. My personal experience working at the clinic, I go there 3-4 times a week. At least once a week, I find myself driving away with tears. And those are not tears of distress. Those are tears of appreciation for what I do. And then I also think about those 60-70% people that are not getting help. And I don't cry over that, but I want to do something about it. So what we want to do ultimately is reach these communities with creating environmental conditions that facilitate that. I think the scalable ways to think about it is these community interventions, train-the-trainers program, web-based programs, and I'll try to kind of briefly share about a lot of different programs that I think can prove helpful. Some of them are backed up by data, some of them are more in pilot stage. This has been the question I've been occupied with since my first year of grad school. And these are the 4 principles that I think are important. It's got to be accessible, you got to be able to reach it, got to be simple to engage with, got to be motivating so you keep doing it, got to be effective, right? In other words, we need cost and result effective interventions, and that's what we're going to try and talk about. So meditation, let us share it with the people. I spoke yesterday about how MP3 files can be effective, so I'm not going too deeply into that. The idea with compassion training files is that actually if we create relatively cost-effective platforms, we can reach thousands of people and see the differences between the different types of applications. So again, another thing is when we run these studies, what I've noticed is you ask people, how many times did you meditate this week? And then it says, oh, I did it every day. 2.5 hours each day. And we believe them because they wrote it on the piece of paper. How about simple web platforms where actually people play it from the platform and you know how much they used it and how long they've played it? Still not perfect, but we get more specificity with data. I learned a lot of these ideas from the VA, the stepped care kind of perspective, where you are able to offer people a little bit for free or for cheap. They engage with that, and that gives them the opportunity to then engage with more, should they be willing, should they be able to. And just the kind of exercise, what were to happen if we were to give $100 million people the opportunity to engage with MP3 files? My guess is that more people would want to take CCT, CBCT, MBSR, so this would actually increase the prevalence of expert-mediated programs. So we're not replacing them. We just want to share this with more people. So I'll tell you about this guy, brilliant guy, Dr. Dan Martin. Everybody that knows him loves him. He's wonderful. And he's really focused on creating these web-based applications. And it doesn't have to come from a clinical perspective. Let me tell you a couple of things that Dan is doing. Oshahidi, you know this? Sure. Oshahidi is you know, genocide in Darfur, rape in France, nuclear problems in Chernobyl. You can ping it, right? Just like you kind of like the crime mapping. So you know anywhere in the world, you just ping it from your smartphone. So usually it's been used for negative things. How about positive things? How about elevation? Dan ran a study, again, very cheap, almost free, with his students, and they just pinged every time they saw someone else doing something pro-social. So you see it popping up, and then it grows in specificity. This is the campus of Cal State East Bay. Students caring for each other is what we report on. And then, for instance, the student says here, there was a classmate who was very sick, left the classroom, a student accompanied him to make sure he's doing okay. One example. What happens when you do that with students? 1 week follow-up essentially shows you a significant increase on a flourishing and compassion for others scale. The thing is, attitudes are great. We really care about walking the walk, about behaviors. So the deal with the behaviors is these are the different parameters for behavioral markers for student climate measures. So the next application of this will actually detail how students are responding behaviorally, because they will have filled out the student climate measures, and that gets connected. So we get attitudinal data as well as clear behavioral data. Lots more I'd love to say, but no time. Here's another brilliant thing by Dan, Mentorum. Mentorship. Again, from my perspective, having each other's backs is what it's all about. So having students be supported by alumni, having junior employees be supported by senior employees in a very structured way that enabled to move forward in your career, as well as receiving emotional support. So I give you very quickly an overview of this. On the left-hand side, you see all the different accomplishments you could have, job, internship, resume, and so forth. On the right-hand side, there's more emotionally relevant thing, more job recognition, satisfaction, security. And what happens, for instance, when a mentee of Dan Martin does well? I was looking forward to saying this. Muy bueno, nuestra primera reunión estuvo muy productiva. So Dan is celebrating the success of his mentee. She gets excited. She posts, she just can't hide it. She posts this on Facebook. Then goes ahead and retweets that stuff. So again, what we see is this chain of, I think, benevolence or virtuous cycles where people are aware of positive things happening. This has a lot more structure to it, and creating simple step-by-step opportunities for people to actually receive the mentorship and follow a structure that we know is helpful. So where is it going now? It's being implemented in a variety of places, nonprofits, international associations. The idea is looking at the attitudinal impact of compassion, and that's where I'm collaborating with Dan. The idea is looking at behavioral markers of people increasing compassion. And another exciting piece, we want to integrate compassion-focused therapy ideas into the web-based protocol as well. I'll share some more ideas about what's going on here. This is Dr. Ricardo Munoz. He's one of the most honorable people that I have met personally. It's just a really a special experience to be around him. He was the head of psychology services at UCSF for many years. He recently transitioned to Palo Alto University, where he's starting the Institute I4Health, Institute for International Internet Intervention for Health at Palo University. His motto is blanket the world with healing and goodness. And when Dr. Doty brought Dr. Paul Gilbert out here, we introduced him with Munoz, and it was an instant click, and now we're basically looking to build on the fabulous intervention framework that Dr. Munoz has been implementing already. Like you see here, he's already reached 157 countries with a variety of different programs. We want to see what happens if we take those programs based on cognitive behavioral principles and add the compassion modules, looking like prevention of depression, resilience, so people are not depressed, or prevention of postpartum depression for pregnant women that have not developed depression. They're in the non-clinical population. We want to make sure they stay in that space of well-being. So again, another way to think about scalability. I wish I could tell you about this awesome project we did about interviewing former gangsters now working as peacemakers. I will say this, it was special. This guy you see here, Rudy Corpus, he's my brother. I love him. It was really a beautiful experience to learn from these people, how they transformed from being hardcore gangsters to being compassionate peacemakers. Now we want to work with them essentially on the ground. If we make iPads with stress reduction and compassion, increased types of applications, which I'm happy to share more about because that's what are the things we're working on, they can actually share that with people on the ground. And I think that if Rudy gives a kid an iPad, there's a good chance it's coming back. So let's talk about some more programs. All right, this is the program that I'm also excited to share with you about, which has kind of like been my baby in many ways, and both practically and philosophically. And one of my challenges with my training in clinical psychology is really focused on my own well-being, or our own well-being, and as psychotherapy clients, increasing my personal resilience. I had an experience which was interesting, coming in contact with people that are deep compassion practice kind of people that do a lot of meditation. When you kind of come, it's kind of like come close to the light, right? There's almost a bubble, this sphere of goodness or good vibe in my language that surrounds them. So it's not just that they're resilient, they contribute to the well-being of others. The best way I was able to encapsulate that visually for myself is with the help of Super Mario, the invisibility stars. So going through the world, essentially, not only are you resilient, you're bringing the good vibe with you. And that is, in my opinion, the next wave of psychology programs. I'm doing better, and because of coming near me, you're doing better as well. That's what we should be striving towards. So VBT, values and behaviors tracking, is essentially a three-piece intervention. The first one, you make contact with the values you uphold the most. The second one, you track your behavioral experiences. The third one, you get some feedback. How is this impacting me? Am I doing better because of being connected with my values and engaging in values-congruent behaviors? I'll go through this very quickly. Self-affirmation, we've gone through this morning, so we don't have to spend a lot of time. I appreciate your comment. It's based definitely on a rich philosophical tradition from folks like Maslow and Carl Rogers, and next time they'll be on the slides too, because that's important. So values, yeah, that's good. So the values piece, how do we do it? I'm going to show you a screenshot from our disturbingly humble website, and it looks something like this. So the idea is that you're given the opportunity to rank your values. Most important thing is adding the values that you care about. Another important piece, journaling is good for you. Write it down. So you give it an opportunity with these little buttons you click on to create a journal feature where you actually get to reflect on your experiences. So okay, so we got the values piece down. And in my mind, values are a compass. They give me the direction of where I want to walk towards. But you're not walking the walk yet, right? You just align with your values, and then what? So I have the right attitude, the right disposition, and I think that we should be able to walk the walk. So how do we follow up behaviorally? So self-affirmation, from what I know, is the most potent intervention within the realm of social and maybe experimental psychology as well. And wouldn't it be nice if we had a nice kind of behavioral intervention that would be kind of potent? So seems like we have one. The most potent intervention that we have for depression, also shown to increase happiness amongst non-clinical populations. I like doing this. Here, happiness, see, non-clinical. So we have a behavioral intervention that improves well-being. It's a clear structure, and I'll share in a little bit of what that looks like. But here's the deal. We're the compassion crew, right? We want to think about how to make people more altruistic, more compassionate. Nice piece of data. Altruism seems like it's good for you, right? So if you do nice things, you volunteer, it looks like you might live a little bit longer too. So that's benefiting you a great deal. So this is probably obvious by now. We augmented the scope of the behavioral activation piece. It's really simple. It's just that it's never been done before in these terms. So this has been around since the 60s or 70s, but now we're just doubling up in the direction. So now behaviors are kindness towards self, kindness towards other. What does it look like? Oh, Mario. Awesome. So what does it look like? It looks like something like this. So the idea is that it's very important for me to say you're not being told what to do. You're offered a menu of opportunities, of experiences to engage with. And every time I mention this, I say this, add activity. The most important are the blank parts. Add your own. We're adding things in there that we think would be helpful, data to back up our suggestions. Adding your own is so important. And by the way, if you want to add an activity like kick the cat, be impatient with your spouse, go for it. Add the activity. See what happens. Experiment with it. I'm not telling you to be good. I'm telling you to experiment with a range of experiences and see how that feeds into your own personal well-being. So the last piece, feedback. Graphs, right? So ain't nothing magical about these graphs, by the way. It's just the best that I thought would be the place to start with. So we have connection with personal values, connection with others, happiness, satisfaction, productivity, sadness. It's modular. You can add any other domain of well-being that you wish. Biomarkers, sure, why not? You can have biomarkers and then see how they link up with behaviors. Let's see what that looks like just a little bit more. So these graphs are enabling you the opportunity to kind of check in on your daily well-being. We'll see what that looks like. You can recognize the contribution of specific behaviors on your well-being. And I'll show you in a minute visually what that looks like. This is kind of a cool feature. I like it a lot. Every 2 weeks, you get a feedback email. And every 2 weeks, that feedback email is telling you, these are your top 5 behaviors for happiness. These are your top 5 activities for productivity in the workplace. These are connection with others. You get the point. And here's the thing. If we have a big enough data set, say 10,000 people, 20,000 people, go through this program, log many, many activities, we get data that is actually indicative on now population level. What are the top activities? What are the top behaviors that are connected with a variety of different types of well-being? And if we can do biomarkers, what are the activities and behaviors among these large populations that actually enable us the opportunity to learn how people are impacted? So I think that would be kind of cool to find out. This is what it looks like. By the way, logging into the program, you can do that in less than 2 minutes per day. So it's got to be brief, got to be quick. I don't want to take up a lot of time, right? You got to work with people really, really quickly. So that's what it looks like in terms of logging. So you log your behaviors, you log your well-being, and then something like this would pop up. This is the visual of the graph. You will have 6 of those or more if you wish to add more and so forth. And the idea is if you hover with your mouse, each one of these bars represent a day. And if you hover, say here, pop, the little box pops up, and today I went for a walk in nature, I volunteered at a food shelter, I had a picnic, I helped children in need, and I phoned a friend.
Before you came here.
Yeah, exactly. It's the time difference. I Skype with Israel. So this is the visual of what it might look like. And then if you pop it up to the next slide, this is the broader gamut of what these things might look like, right? So you have these different domains of well-being, and if you hover again with your mouse on the screen, these boxes will pop up. And this is actually an opportunity for a story of your life. This is the story of my activities and my variety of well-being domains, how they interact with my activities. So now I want to say something more. So, you know, the thing about the modular piece is we want to have these different interventions being synergistic with each other, right? So for instance, I'm thinking I'm the CFT guy. I start making these slides. I'm like, all right, cool. I'll put in some buttons with MP3 files, right? So I put in a variety of CFT files. And then I'm thinking, here's this idea. And I look at the screen, I'm thinking this idea from Dr. Doty, the compassion gymnasium. And then I start thinking, what happened to me 10 years ago when I was getting trained to be a fitness trainer? And I'm still lamenting the loss of the six-pack. But when I was getting trained as a fitness trainer, and we were learning how to work the bicep or the tricep or all these things, right? And we learned dozens of exercises for each muscle. That made me think, well, compassion is being described as a muscle, right? Well, maybe the idea is that we need a variety of angles, different exercises to stimulate that muscle of compassion. And then I'm thinking we can just throw in more buttons, right? So why not have a CCT audio file, CBCT, MBSR? We like the body stuff, right? So why not have a video of yoga and posture? People can be a great support system for themselves. Gilbert has actually really interesting data about the value of speaking to yourself with kindness, the user's own voice with self-affirmation. That can be really potent. That can be a beautiful thing. The most amazing thing, or one of the most amazing things I've learned this year, is how therapeutic the voice of Mindy McGrady can be. So we can actually have people check in with songs that they like based on lyrics that they like, and that can be very therapeutic. We can have audio and video files of close friends and family members that are actually being supportive of this particular person. And then you have it. A cheap compassion gymnasium. I think of it as like my 24 fitness subscription. You can go all over. It's not expensive. It's a place to start. So we can share all these things with people for a reasonably low cost. VBT, and this is not just about VBT. I think this should be inspiration for many programs. It should be able to stand alone. It can supplement. We've done a little pilot in Hong Kong. It wasn't controlled, just a little experiment with a group of teenagers in a private high school in Hong Kong. All these different groups can actually be supplemented by this VBT program. Of course, we're going to integrate that with the CCARE mentor as well, with the super tremendous Dan Martin. So all these things are feasible. These are options that...
Super Mario?
You know, he is that, exactly. He's Luigi.
Oh.
All right. So, and then the last thing I want to kind of wrap up with the summary, I want to reiterate that point. Reiterate it because, again, if we have things that are accessible, simple, motivating, and effective, I think we can really move stuff forward. What I've tried to do here is essentially show that on the back end, we can have very complex philosophical ideas from postmodernism, constructivism, humanism, empirical psychology, evidence-based psychotherapies, Buddhism, all these different ideas, thanks for saying that, all these different ideas can be integrated on the back end, but on the front end, we have a very simple, ideally, exercise that launches a simple experience, an experience that actually becomes meaningful for people, an experience that sticks with people in the longer run and entails a behavioral component as well. And I think that if we embrace this perspective, we can really reach a lot of people. And ultimately, I want to share with you that my personal mission in life, the way that I see it. These are my 2 core goals, and that's what I hope to share with as many people as possible. Is 1 is connection with core values, and 2 is kindness to self and other. And thank you. Yeah.
So again, I'm a social psychologist. There's a huge literature on compassion, altruism within social psychology. I could talk for hours about this. I don't have hours. I'll try to do this in like 10 minutes tops. But I want to show you the social context is very important. Social context dictates so much of our pro-social behavior. And a lot of researchers have tried to catalog the ways in which these contextual factors fall out. Famously, Peter Singer has this great thought experiment. You're walking past a shallow pond. You are on your way to give a talk. Maybe it's a job talk or in your finest new suit. You hear a splashing sound and a child is in the water struggling to swim. The question is, do you jump into the water to save the child? If you're not a heartless bastard, you probably would say yes, obviously. Now what about this? You receive a letter from UNICEF asking you to donate money to help save starving children overseas. Doesn't have to be that much. Even a nickel might make a small difference in aggregate. But yet many of us have no problem just throwing this UNICEF envelope in the trash. So what is it about the social context that causes us to feel a lot of compassion here, and be very pro-social, but be very callous in that kind of situation? Some of the types of social influence and contextual factors that seem to matter that I'll discuss very briefly, things like time pressure, the presence of others, crises that have large numbers of suffering victims. Appraisals and attributions, things like whether you blame the person in need of help, whether you feel similar to the other person, whether you think that person is relevant to your own goals, values, and projects. And then attitudes, a fear of compassion has come up in some of Yotam's talks, a very interesting idea that we are afraid of the experience of compassion, perhaps the emotional or financial costs. And also identification with all humanity. The idea that some people on a trait level are more willing to open themselves up and identify with people outside their immediate in-group. So we talked a little bit about the bystander effect in regards to Gael's presentation. Just the idea that if others are around, it can often inhibit pro-social behavior. Classic studies in social psychology from the 70s and 80s. We talked about the Good Samaritan study. Seminary students who were told they could be giving a lecture on the Good Samaritan or a control lecture. And they were either told, hey, you're early, you have plenty of time, or you're running really late. What they found was that despite the fact that these were seminary students, some of whom had been told, you're talking about the Good Samaritan, the only thing that seemed to matter was how much time they had. Whether they stopped and helped someone who was suffering in need on the way to their talk, if they were in a hurry, they didn't really do so. There's other work on basically how we use others to interpret what we should do in helping situations. This idea of pluralistic ignorance, that if we think others are interpreting something in a certain way, it can cause us to act in ways that we would not do so otherwise. The smoke-filled room study, you're in a room with ostensibly other participants. You see smoke emanating from under a door. The question is, what do you do? Do you get up to actually investigate what's going on? When people were alone, they 75% intervened. But when there were 2 passive Confederates who did nothing, they interpreted it as a non-emergency. They didn't do much at all. And the bystander effect, just the basic notion that if there are others around who aren't helping, we're much less likely to help. All right. So, yeah, that study. All right. I'm rushing through this. I'm already like 4 minutes. Jeez. I want to describe, how about this? Because I know you're hungry, I want to present what I think is one really interesting social context that I think really speaks to how to understand the scope of compassion. You've probably all heard the famous quote by Joseph Stalin that one death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. The idea is that when faced with the suffering of that many people, we just don't really have any strong emotional engagement. Mother Teresa said a very similar thing. If I look at the mass, I will never act, and if I look at the one, I will. And the idea here is that if she thought about just how many suffering people there are in the world, it would be emotionally paralyzing and might inhibit pro-social action. Now, when Stalin and Mother Teresa agree on something, that's worth taking note of. It suggests a very powerful psychological context that's worth exploring. This comparison between what we feel for one and what we feel for many. Now, within a lot of studies in psychology have run this comparison. How much compassion do you feel for the single identifiable victim as opposed to hundreds or thousands of victims? And surprisingly, what you find is that people feel much more compassion for one than for many. You see this if you compare one victim against statistical victims, like hundreds of thousands, one against a handful, like 8 or 12, and even one against 2. Even if you have just one victim and then 2, you see this drop-off in compassion and charitable behavior. And this should strike you as fairly counterintuitive. I mean, these are the cases in which compassion as a moral emotion should be most necessary for moral action. And yet we're feeling it it's precisely in those contexts that we're feeling it the least. So, are there limits on compassion? One popular account by Paul Slovic suggests something called psychic numbing, that when faced with the suffering of large numbers of victims, we just don't have a very strong automatic emotional impulse. It might be hard to imagine the suffering of that many people. And when there's many suffering victims, it might divide our attention and inhibit the emotional response that would result. So much like our eyes are sensitive to certain wavelengths of light, it might be that our moral intuitions, our moral emotions, are only sensitive to certain numbers of victims. They did studies trying to prime analytic deliberative thinking to see if that would increase compassion felt for large numbers of victims. But rather than increasing compassion for the many, it rather perversely decreased compassion for one victim. For those reasons, proponents of this perspective suggest that this is just a basic constraint on how much compassion that we can feel for others. This is the kind of data that people like Paul Bloom suggest makes compassion an unreliable moral emotion. It has these basic limits. It's innumerate. It's not sensitive to these large situations like humanitarian crises, genocides, environmental, global warming, things like that that might call upon our compassion. But what I've suggested in my work is that this might be a little bit more complicated. It might not be that there are strict capacity limitations on how much compassion that we can feel for others, but rather that we are afraid of compassion, that we are motivated to turn away from our compassion because we're concerned about the costs. And what I've done in my work is to understand how if we manipulate the motivations to avoid compassion and look at emotion regulation as the mechanism, can we understand these apparent failures of compassion in these large-scale crises? And what it suggests is that actually in these situations we do have the ability to feel a decent amount of compassion. So let me show you what I did. Basically in my studies I show people images of 1 or 8 suffering victims, ostensibly from the Darfur region of Sudan, much like you would see in traditional charity advertisements. And we find the basic kind of the collapse of compassion effect, that compassion decreases as the numbers increase, but importantly what we find is that it's moderated by the motivation to avoid compassion and emotion regulation related variables. And so we find this collapse of compassion. You feel more for one compassion than for more compassion for one victim than many victims. But what we find is that that in turn depends upon whether you have the motivation to avoid compassion in the first place, and also whether you have the emotion regulation ability to turn away. So let me just show you a couple examples of this. We had one study where we had people read about 1 or 8 victims, as you saw. They were given the expectation in one condition, in the help request condition, that later on in the study, we're going to ask you to actually make a donation. We're going to attach a price tag to the compassionate response. But in the no help request condition, we remove that expectation. If this is really about the motivation to avoid compassion for many victims because of the perceived cost, then changing cost motivation should move this effect around. And that's exactly what we find. We found a non-significant trend for more compassion for 1 than 8 in the help request condition. But critically, when you remove that cost motivation, people feel more compassion for 8 than for 1. Suggests that it's not necessarily a basic limitation, it's a more motivational phenomenon. If we unpack those motivations, those fears of compassion, we can begin to understand just what is the scope? How much can we move it around? Is it really enumerate? Is it really that limited? Already at 10 minutes, darn. So, yeah, I guess in the interest of time, I can stop there and we can talk more at lunch.
Go to 12:30 and we'll just come back at 1:30.
Okay, sure thing.
Did you look at self-efficacy, agency, some of that?
That's a great question. So there's reason to believe that if you feel more efficacious in helping, that would be another reason for you to turn towards compassion. But if you feel that you're in a situation where your compassion, your altruism will not make much of a difference, that might be a motivational factor that would lead you to downregulate the compassionate response. Related to this, we ran another study looking at emotion regulation skill. So if people are motivated to avoid compassion, then it's the people who can regulate their emotions well that should show this collapse of compassion. So if I am concerned about the costs of compassion, if I think that I'm going to feel a lot of compassion for suffering people and it's going to be very costly and I'm motivated to avoid it, then I can only really enact that avoidance strategy if I have sufficient regulatory ability. And that's exactly what we find. We had people read about 1, 4, or 8 victims, same thing as before. We had them look at these victims over the course of a minute's period of time and rate how upset they felt. We found an interaction between number of victims and how well you can regulate your emotions. So for people who could not regulate their emotions well, they don't show this collapse of compassion between 1, 4, and 8, even when they have the motivation to do so. But critically, people who can skillfully control their emotions, they prevent compassion towards multiple victims from coming online in the first place, suggesting that this collapse I've been talking about is not some basic limitation, not some basic constraint. It's dependent upon having the motivation and the ability to control our emotions. Yes?
Have you looked at the collapse of compassion affected cross-culture?
We have not. They've done some work in Israel, but I don't think there isn't that much cross-cultural work. But to the degree the different cultures have different norms about whom to feel compassion for, about the acceptability of compassion, it's certainly feasible that you'd see cultural variation in motivation.
And also there's different levels of exposure to suffering on a daily basis.
Yeah, so if you're living in a society where you see this kind of trauma on a day-to-day basis, yeah, there aren't any, as far as I'm aware, aren't any studies that could make that comparison. Yeah, but that's an interesting point. And what this exemplifies is this more basic construct of empathy avoidance or compassion avoidance. Dan Batson talks about this in the mid-90s. The basic point is that people sometimes strategically avoid triggers of compassion if they're concerned about the costs. The kinds of costs that might be salient in helping situations could be things like financial expense, concerns about emotional exhaustion and burnout, and intergroup aversion. We are following this up. We're interested in looking at intergroup biases in the collapse of compassion. So does it matter if the victims that I'm reading about are of my own in-group or not? We ran a study, and let me just unpack this real quick. We had people read about either 1 or 8 victims of Hurricane Katrina. The victims were either white or black, and the participants themselves were white. Now we found this, it's always fun to unpack three-way interactions. This three-way interaction between number of victims, 1 or 8, the race of the victims, white or black, and a trait variable called motivation to control prejudice. And what we found was that for people who were low on the motivation to control prejudice, this interesting intergroup bias in the collapse of compassion. These are people who are not very concerned with being unprejudiced. We found this increase in compassion from 1 to 8 when the victims were white. But when the victims were black, we saw this collapse of compassion from 1 to 8, suggesting that intergroup biases, intergroup aversions, can feed in as another motivational factor that kind of changes the scope of our compassion response. So this is, I should say, a work in progress, not published, but again suggestive that the intergroup considerations or another motivational factor that feed into this process. Now, we talked about blame and deservingness as another attribution that might matter for compassion. And a lot of social psychological work of stigmatized groups in American society, like homeless individuals and drug addicts, suggests that we don't feel much compassion for these individuals. We feel a great deal of disgust instead. And not only that, but the lack of compassion often manifests in a process called dehumanization. We don't attribute these individuals the kinds of mental characteristics like intentionality, consciousness, pain that characterizes someone as a human being. Now, we're doing studies now to try to understand, is this dehumanization of stigmatized outgroups also driven by a motivated emotion regulation process? Is it driven by the fear that, you know, if I walked past this guy in the street, if I were to empathize with this guy, I would just get exhausted. His plight is so severe that were I to really empathize and feel compassion, it would just totally drain my resources. This is, again, ongoing work, but we looked at comparing two fictional individuals, a drug addict and a morally neutral person. We measured something called the Mind Scale. This is work by Kurt Gray and Dan Wegner, basically attributing different mental characteristics like intentionality, self-control, pain. And we measured emotional burnout, the degree to which people feel that emotionally they are exhausted, burnt out, and tired. And what we find is that this dehumanization effect, this comparison right here, this dehumanization of a stigmatized drug addict, only emerged for people who were high in trait levels of burnout. What we're trying to do now is manipulate expectations about how exhausting, how emotionally exhausting and draining compassion would be to see if we can find a manipulation of this effect. Okay. One more quick thing. So, as I've heard talks about the fear of compassion, this is a very related and similar construct. This idea that we are afraid of feeling compassion for others. Perhaps we've had negative experiences in the past due to life history with extending compassion. In other words, maybe extending compassion to others has gotten us burned. So can we think about using fear of compassion as a trait variable to understand these decisions of whom to allocate compassion to? So this is some of my dissertation work. Again, work in progress, just new stuff. We had people look at images of homeless individuals that have been normed as eliciting equivalent amounts of compassion and disgust. And we had them rate how much disgust, how much compassion, how much distress do you feel? This was the first pass we took. And we assessed fear of compassion for others. Has items like, I worry that if I am compassionate, people will be drawn to me and drain my emotional resources. Being too compassionate makes people soft. And there are some people in life who just don't deserve compassion. And what we found an interaction between the type of emotion that was rated and fear of compassion. So emotion intensity is on the y-axis with different bars for the different emotions. For people who were low in fear of compassion, they felt more compassion than disgust or distress. But for people who were high in fear of compassion, this reverses, suggesting that as a trait variable, fear of compassion is going to calibrate the kinds of emotional experiences you have towards these ambiguous, stigmatized characters. Now, we have tried to follow that up with more implicit measurement techniques. So this is another study. Again, I apologize, it's a multi-level interaction. But basically what we did, we were looking for a person-by-situation interaction. We measured fear of compassion. We also manipulated whether people expected that helping someone else was going to be costly or not. We did that approach avoidance task that I described earlier. You see a picture of a homeless individual, and we look at reaction times to either approach or avoid. So this is coded as impulsive avoidance. Higher numbers mean more avoidance or less impulsive approach. If you accept the premise that impulsive approach is something like compassion, then you could see this as an indirect measure of compassion. For people who expected that helping was going to be costly, as fear of compassion increased, they became more impulsively avoidant. In other words, when helping was going to be costly, the people who were the most afraid of helping on a trait level became more impulsively avoidant of these homeless individuals. But when you tell people helping is not going to be that costly in the first place, when you diffuse concerns about cost, that reverses. Fear of compassion no longer leads to greater impulsive avoidance, it leads to less, suggesting that we should think about traits like fear of compassion in interaction with these social contexts that people find themselves in.
Really quickly, what is the way by which you measure approach avoidance?
It's the approach avoidance paradigm I presented in the first thing. It's basically you see a homeless individual, the mannequin task above or below, you code reaction times to either approach or avoid. All right, so there's plenty of other variables that matter. I could talk about socioeconomic status, similarity. There's great work showing that if you induce compassion in the lab, it can change and increase similarity towards weak and powerless others. That if you prime similarity through non-conscious synchrony, it increases compassion towards others. People who are higher socioeconomic status, higher power, class, report less compassion. And people who are more willing to identify with all humanity also show a variety of compassion and prosocial increases. So again, could be hours of stuff to cover, but that's just a brief sample. So thanks.